Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kelly Jin, and I serve as Vice President for Community and National Initiatives at the Knight Foundation. I am simply delighted to be here today to kick things off and welcome all of you to our conversation titled Public Spaces as Infrastructure: How to Use Federal Stimulus Dollars to Advance Equity and Transform Our Cities. I want to start off by saying a particular thank you to the entire communities team for organizing, and especially Kyle Kudachief, our Akron Program Director, for moderating today's conversation. At Knight, we've invested in public spaces, which we define loosely as spaces open to all, like plazas, squares, parks, streets, and more, with the belief that inclusive public spaces can connect and attach us to each other and the places that we live in, and in turn bolster engaged, equitable, and inclusive cities, our North Star here at the Foundation. Today, you'll get a chance to hear directly from Julia Day and Eamon O'Connor from GEL, who lead research into community involvement and engagement as a significant factor for increasing usage, attachment, and trust in public spaces. They'll touch upon actionable takeaways from the report for you, our audience, as you design recovery for each of your cities, and in 2021, how we can intentionally design public spaces in collaboration with community, perhaps as a vehicle for addressing some more systemic issues. Lastly, I want to note that in my virtual listening tour, as I started at the Foundation nearly 3 months ago, I heard a chorus from communities that understand that the federal dollars are a once-in-a-lifetime moment and opportunity, and they hope to seize upon this moment to use those dollars equitably and efficiently. I hope that you find value in today's discussion, and we at the Foundation look forward to hearing more of your ideas on leveraging this moment. Now, without further delay, I will hand things over to Eamon and Julia to get our session started. Thank you both for joining us today. I'm delighted you're both here, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thrilled to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Day, a director at GEL New York. I focus on developing projects that demonstrate public space as vital to our health, economies, and well-being, and look forward to sharing some of our recent work with you.
And I'm Eamon O'Connor. I'm a project manager at GEL, also out of our New York office. Really looking forward to exploring with you all how public spaces can guide in a more equitable recovery as we share our findings from our impact assessment in just a moment. I'll hand it back to you, Julia.
Thanks, Eamon. So first, before we launch into the Adaptive Public Spaces report, GEL is an urban design research and strategy consultancy that works to center people and lived experience in the city-making process. We use an evidence-based approach focused on the public space, public life methodology to illustrate the connection between our behavior in public space and the built environment. Using this, we help cities gather data and stories on what we all care about, but that is often very difficult to measure, such as our sense of belonging or our social connections. We do this work because we believe public spaces are a key component of engaging, equitable, and thriving communities. The research we just did with Knight emphasized 2 core things. 1, public spaces are vital components of our civic infrastructure. And 2, it identified the key drivers of engaging in equitable spaces. Together, it is our hope that these findings will help make the case for more investment in public spaces and identify how those investments can be made for the greatest impact. I'll pass it to Eamon, who will take us through the report and some of these findings in more detail and what we think they mean for this recovery.
Thanks, Julia. So we recently released this report, Adaptive Public Space, Places for People in the Pandemic and Beyond, in collaboration with the Knight Foundation. And we realize that it's coming at an especially critical moment for civic leaders and communities across the country. This is an important moment as we navigate the COVID-19 recovery and the many deep-seated crises it has laid bare. And we also know that many civic leaders are awaiting infrastructure dollars, but not necessarily sure where they can go and how they can be spent in the most equitable and efficient manner possible. Moreover, it's a challenge to demonstrate that public spaces are not just nice to haves, they're essential spaces to support our health, our local economies, and our trust in local institutions. We believe public spaces have a vital role to play in this process. So to give you a little bit of a background on our study, we conducted a multi-method impact assessment to understand the impact of 7 public spaces in 4 cities, Akron, Detroit, Philadelphia, and San Jose. If you'd like to read more about our report, you can visit kf.org/adaptivespace to learn more. The spaces we studied varied widely. They were a mix of nature spaces, smaller scale neighborhood parks, citywide destinations, and as you can see on the screen, their look, feel, and energy varies widely their look, feel, and energy varies widely. But with the right ingredients, throughout the project lifecycle, we found that public spaces can guide an equitable recovery. And they can guide this equitable recovery for the sake of our health, our economy, and our democracy. And here's a few key ways that they've done just that in these 7 public spaces across Akron, Detroit, Philadelphia, and San Jose. So public spaces have helped us recover our health for many, many years, but perhaps most especially in this recent pandemic, where we saw people seek out public spaces as a refuge for their physical and their mental health. We saw a rise in foot traffic and activity across many of the public spaces we studied, in many cases as people were sort of stir crazy, seeking public spaces as an outlet for their exercise, as a place of calm and serenity in a very challenging time. Spaces like Ella Fitzgerald Park in Detroit continued to host their hula hoop troupe, which continued to meet during the pandemic, but we also saw at Summit Lake Park in Akron, Ohio, that markets like its fresh food market continue to help ensure healthy food access and security in this community. We also discovered how public spaces have become a real driver of economic growth in their communities. And we believe that as a result, public spaces can help us recover our economy as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the case because public spaces can generate jobs, they can catalyze small business growth, and they can power equitable community economic development. So for example, at San Jose Moment, a micro retail space, all 10 of the micro retail spaces tenants to date have been women, and 8 have been women of color. Each of them has spoken to how the project has really catalyzed their small business growth and their creativity. We've also seen how maintenance can be a pathway to workforce development and job creation, such as in Ella Fitzgerald Park in Detroit, where 20 different local residents have been employed through a workforce program in partnership with the city and the local organization Greening of Detroit. But we also see more broadly that the public space planning process and design process can become a platform for broader conversations around equitable, community-centered economic development. At Summit Lake Park in Akron, Ohio, James, who will join us in a moment, spoke about just that. And how the public space was in many ways the first step in powering an over $15 million vision planning process that's now underway in the long disinvested Summit Lake neighborhood. We also see how public space can help us recover our democracy and our trust in local institutions and civic life. In our study, we found that sustained funding for these projects and community participation throughout the project lifecycle really helped residents regain civic trust and pride in their neighborhood, and local institutions, and local government. This happened because residents were encouraged to participate early on in the project planning process. Pop-ups and pilots were a sort of a visible marker of the local institution's commitment to the public space planning and design process. And in the words of one resident, Grace Hudson from Summit Lake, we really saw the manifestation of this conversation bloom into actual fruits of the conversation. So to be able to see that sort of that visible fruit come to life in the form of public space really helps residents regain trust in the institutions that maybe have not always cared for their needs historically due to long-time disinvestment. We also see, though, that after the design process, spaces like the Discovery Center in Philadelphia have made sort of ongoing community governance and participation and power building a part of their structure. Ensuring community representation on their boards, very well engaged staff and volunteer engagement teams that help drive community participation and continued pride in the space. And this sense of ownership and pride really translates, to the day-to-day use of these spaces as people, build a sense of ownership over the space. It draws less litter and vandalism, but in the words of Chris Spar from Philadelphia Centennial Commons, it also builds a sense of pride in neighborhood and place. So now is the moment, based on these findings, to really commit to public space as a vital form of infrastructure in our communities, a form of infrastructure that can improve our health, that can generate jobs, that can support civic life. Again, if you'd like to learn more about our report, you're welcome to visit it online at kf.org/adaptive space, but I'll hand it over to Julia to close us out.
Thanks, Eamon. So, you know, as many of you listening in may have been following, the term infrastructure is being expanded, and we love that. It's to expand more than roads and bridges. Yet we know that we need to keep expanding on this to ensure it also includes public spaces and the organizations and agencies that make them run. Delivering on this means funding what would actually make public spaces hum, the people and the essential work they do to keep them open and welcoming beyond the ribbon cutting. Today, as we recover from the pandemic, we want to create a better future, not simply to return to how things were. We are recovering more than our health and our economic security. We are recovering our trust in government and our civic institutions. And to get there, we need sustained investment in our public spaces. So we're thrilled to be here and to hear what the panelists and the local leaders who you're going to hear from have to say. And with that, I'll pass it back to Kyle Kudichieff with the Knight Foundation.
Julia, Eamon, thank you so much for those comments and overview of the report. You did an excellent job of taking something very long and condensing it into a great intro to begin our conversation today, so thank you. As Julia mentioned, I'm Kyle Kudichieff. I'm fortunate to be Knight Foundation's program director in Akron, and I have the pleasure of moderating an excellent panel to talk about exactly what Julia said. We're in a moment where cities are seeing a significant shift in their cash position, and we want to talk about how we make the most of that moment and the months and years ahead. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. Rhonda Chapman is the Equity Director at Trust for Public Land. Joe Courtwright is the Director of City Observatory in Portland, Oregon. And James Hardy is the Deputy Mayor for Integrated Development at the City of Akron. Panel, welcome. And to kick us off, Rhonda, I'd like to start with you give each of you a moment to share some opening reflections on what GEL shared or what you're thinking about public spaces as we head into this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you, everybody, for allowing us to be here. The Trust for Public Land really honors this space. So in terms of the report, I really appreciated the centering of community, particularly as it relates and resonates very strongly to the work that we're doing at the Trust for Public Land. We are very focused on advancing equity and community health and climate resilience, and we can't do so without putting community at the center. And so I might be stating the obvious when I say this, but we will always be playing a game of catch up when it comes to prioritizing communities here in the US. These are the communities that have been made vulnerable to bad policies since the beginning of our democracy, as Eamon pointed out. So I felt like the report really resonated with some of the principles that we have along the lines of centering community. And so in doing so, we need to make sure that we have those guardrails in place to guarantee that we're not going to further any past harms, that we will instead set them up for long-term sustainable well-being, which is what we just heard from Julia. So there's just so much that got me excited about it. I think your point around taking a really complex issue and condensing it in a very readable and accessible way was really beneficial. And thinking about it in terms of this tranche of funding that's coming out, we're witnessing the current administration call out racial equity through various executive orders and in the various committees that are being formed, which is super exciting. And in that process, though, we have to act with the swiftness, because as invigorating as it is, it's just a flashpoint in time. And we really do need to be thinking about the long game. We need to be thinking about the next administration and the administration after that, and thinking about our future generations. And so while we have this like tension between, okay, so we have these toolkits, we have these recommendations and all of these amazing tips for how to really invest in community in public spaces, the challenge I see is that we need to do so with care. And that care comes with the process, particularly when it comes to the rapid deployment of these federal dollars. So I appreciated that the report encouraged us to really invest in capacity building. I appreciate the truth behind doing so in a way that encourages us to limit the traditional funding restrictions that come along with these dollars as often as possible. And then lastly, I would just add that when we put federal dollars into community, that's a really, really good thing. But at the same time, if we're not taking corrective action to address the history of place, to address the root of the inequities, then the communities are just going to find themselves in the same position after the quick fix of funding. So that's really what I pulled from the report. I was very happy to see it articulated in such a way and just the chance to restate it.
Rhonda, thank you so much. Joe, what are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting to see the diversity of projects and the impacts that they had on the local communities and the uptake that you see in the use of public space when we make investments in it that are the kinds of things that people are looking for. And to me, just to expand the context of that, I think what it shows is really an unrequited demand for great and better and more inclusive urban spaces. And that, that's been part of our work at City Observatory, is really understanding where the market is moving. By market, I mean, what people want. And we see a big demand for walkable communities. We know that people, because we don't have very many great walkable communities in the United States, have to pay a premium to live in them. But that signals that there's a real economic value associated with those. We see lots of young people moving back into urban neighborhoods. And a big component of that is the kind of quality of public space that's available in those places. So what this signals to me is, and it should signal, I think, to policymakers, is when we make these, smart, judicious, inclusive investments in public spaces, it has an impact on the market. It meets a real need, and then that can be a platform and a stimulus to improving the economy and the sustainability of places. So I was good to see that very particular evidence of how these projects function to meet that really unrequited demand for urban space.
And James, how about you?
Yeah, I would ditto the comments from my fellow panelists, and I would say that again, making the hard link between public space and economic development is so important, especially now, given how cities, people in my position, are looking at the guidance that came out yesterday, still trying to dissect it, to digest it, and figure out how to make place a priority. And so I think that by making the connection between public space not being just a nice thing to have if you could afford it, but really truly as a platform and catalyst for economic and community regeneration is something that we need to focus on. And then I would double down also on something that Joe said around the importance of recognizing that place means different things in different places. And one of my colleagues, Alexa Bush from Detroit, says this, and I think it's true, that in dense urban places, public spaces are the living room for lots of people. They need it. And then you look in sort of post-industrial America, where it's Detroit and Akron, and everybody's primarily in a single family house. And so they look at public space from a very different perspective. And so making sure, sort of coming full circle to what Rhonda said, that your process is good so that you're building and you're investing in space design and space utilization that actually matches what the community wants, as opposed to what seems to be trendy. So that's what I thought.
Great. Thank you, James. And one note for our audience, as you're listening to the discussion, you can also participate and share your questions. Their questions are being monitored on Zoom, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and on Twitter using the hashtag Public Spaces Lab. So you write a question someplace, we are going to find it and try to work it in with our panel. James, I want to stay with you, if you don't mind. How big a deal is the American Rescue Plan for a city like Akron?
So I'll paraphrase President Biden from when he was VP. It's a BFD. I mean, it's a big freaking deal. The federal government, the federal government I would say for the last, since the 1970s, quite honestly, since Richard Nixon, believe it or not, has been declining and cutting its direct aid and support to cities. And that's over Democrats, Republicans, doesn't matter. And so this is a huge shift in policy, and one that is really comes at a critical time, but also like with anything, federal money, these have strings attached. And so to Rhonda's point, in terms of we want to be thoughtful, we need to be thoughtful, but we also have 3 years to get the money out the door. And so we're very lucky and in Akron from the standpoint that through the Civic Commons work and through some of the other engagements that we've been doing the last 5 or 6 years, process is very much ingrained in how we're approaching it, which is how I think we were able to convince the mayor in his initial framework that was released a few weeks ago to put 30 million of the city of Akron's 153 earmark it for public space. And so I think that clearly wouldn't have happened without a lot of legwork. But I think it's also going to be important for cities that maybe are approaching this with a bit of a fire exercise, meaning, they didn't necessarily have a process in place. They're now getting more money than they've seen in a long time. How do they both build the political will within their local municipalities for public space? But then to Rhonda's point, how do you stay intentional and make sure that your process and your ultimate investment is equitable from a lot of different lenses?
So let's build on that point. Rhonda, as you hear James' comments, what makes public spaces an immediate and actionable place to advance equity?
Well, from a green space and parks perspective, our research at the Trust for Public Land has found that 100 million people, which is about more than 1 in 3 Americans, or more than one in 3 people in the United States, including 28 million children, don't have access to a park within a 10-minute walk or jaunt. And so the data reveals that all across the country, the parks that are serving primarily non-white populations are half the size of the parks that are serving majority white populations and 5 times more crowded. So when we're talking about this in terms of equity and in terms of deployment of federal funding, all we need to do is look back at the pandemic that we're still in. We still have a bunch of inequities flitting about us. We see that the need for safe, quality outdoor access is super, super apparent. And so when we're talking about it in terms of creating jobs, so we've got the Parks, Jobs, and Equity Act. That is a great opportunity for us to take what my panelists and I are bringing together under one umbrella, right? We're investing in the economics, creating job workforce, we're investing in, in equity, we're investing in parks. These are the opportunities for us to move forward. So the challenge is though, we shouldn't need a global crisis to inspire these investments. When we're in the state of only taking the reactive approaches, which we kind of don't have much choice. It's like, here's a bunch of money, as James has pointed out, you have 3 years to spend it. When we have to take those kind of practices on, we lose people and other assets along the way. And then we find ourselves paying a greater cost later on down the road. So we need to be thinking beyond this moment, as I said earlier, but the time is now. We've seen it from our cities. We've seen it in our rural areas as well. We really don't have much choice but to move forward and invest in these spaces.
And as a quick follow-up, one of the data points that TPL has become very well known for is the walk score. How do you think about the walk score or other data points helping cities be a bit more strategic about making sure underserved communities get resources in the next couple of years for public space?
Sure. So we have the Park Score. And that's actually about to get re-released. We do an annual launch, so everybody be on the lookout on May 27th. We're going to be launching that. And the reason why that's so important is we have brought on an equity indicator for that. So people are able to use that data. The Park Score Index ranks how well park systems in the 100 largest cities are serving the residents there. And it's been a tool for municipal leaders and other park advocates to compare the acreage, the investment, the amenities, and the access of these parks to communities. And so with that, we use our ParkServe, which is also a comprehensive database of parks in 14,000 cities and towns across the US. And we work with the park agencies and community-based organizations for them to identify where the parks are most needed based on population density, based on children, and based on low-income households. So those are accessible resources that folks can go to TPL.org and find access to those. That we definitely are trying to put out as much data as possible so that our city planners can prioritize appropriately.
Thank you. The Park Score, that is a park that is a 10-minute walk from a resident. That's the goal, right?
That's the goal. Everybody within a 10-minute walk. That's right.
Thanks for the correction. So, Joe, James outlined a process referring to a potential, fire drill. A lot of money coming in fast, and cities trying to figure out the best place to put it. That doesn't always lead to the best outcomes. Or, if we look at our history, the big money seems to go into adding a lane to a highway or doing some kind of bland, high dollar, low impact infrastructure investment. How are you thinking about cities doing more with this moment in time?
Yeah, I think that's the big challenge that we face, because in a way, some of the way this is being pitched is as a recovery program, like a classic public works recovery program, where the effort is to get a lot of people employed. And I think if we view it that way, that's really a mistake, because it doesn't really matter what you spend the money on, it all creates jobs. The question is really the legacy that it creates. And I think, we face an uphill battle in some respects, because first of all, as we all know, in the matter of political vernacular, infrastructure to most people means roads and bridges. That's what they say. What that misses to me is that, not all infrastructure is equally good or equally useful or is timely. I mean, in the 1940s and 50s, maybe building roads and bridges was critical to our economy. But it's not at all clear that the US suffers from a shortage of roads and bridges today. And in fact, arguably, particularly freeway widenings are the kind of infrastructure that spread us or tear us apart rather than bring us together, as opposed to the kinds of infrastructure we've been talking about today in terms of parks and public spaces, which are the things that do bring us together and help make us a more inclusive community. And that are, in many respects, both as indicated by Park Score, by Walk Score, and other things, are in short supply. They're the things that we need. And I think, in many respects, maybe what we need to do is think back to, the Great Depression and the New Deal, and the legacy that I think we can find in every one of our communities of the projects that were constructed by the Works Progress Administration. Many of them were parks, a lot of them were public spaces, a lot of them were sort of iconic structures that all signified the importance of the commons and public spaces. So I think that's something that as advocates we need to talk about, is what's the right infrastructure that we need for the situation that we find ourselves in today, challenged as we are by social upheaval, by the need to recover from the pandemic, and to cope with climate change. And all of those priorities ought to take us in a very different direction than the now outdated idea that infrastructure is somehow roads and bridges.
James, what's your reflections on what Joe just shared?
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I've been using that terminology in terms of thinking about the New Deal and the Great Depression, and particularly Works Progress Administration, but also the Civilian Conservation Corps. We heard in the presentation from Gail the greening of Detroit programs and some of the things that are already underway in a lot of our communities, but could be seeded and grown and become more impactful with these dollars. And I think that the other piece of it, and I think we're all sort of preaching to the choir, probably to the people that are listening in as well, that infrastructure needs to be more than roads and bridges. I would only go a little bit farther to say that quality is also important. So it's not just enough, in my opinion, to count the acreage of green space in your particular neighborhood or in your particular city. What is the quality? What is in the space? Is the space responsive and welcoming to the immediate neighborhood? And I think that that's something that we value quite a bit in Akron. One of our values is beauty is a basic right, and we mean that in lots of different ways. But one of them is, beauty in nature. You should have the ability to go to your neighborhood park, and it should have the things that you needed there. It should be exciting. It should be welcoming. It should be attractive. And so it's not just a big green field, and we call it a park. So I think that's the other thing that we're thinking about is how do we improve quality within our existing acreage, as much as we are thinking about, adding parks, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so sort of the park version of not adding lanes, right? Some cities need to add park. But in some cities like Akron, for example, we're way above national average when it comes to the amount of acreage per person. What we're looking at is, where is that acreage? Is it equitable? To Rhonda's point, is it accessible to everyone in our neighborhoods, regardless of where you live? And then, is it quality?
One of the lines that stuck with me in Gail's intro was the right ingredients for public spaces. And that this is not just about building a bunch of capital projects, but it's about co-creation with residents, making sure that the neighbors and the neighborhoods where these projects are going to be done are a part of the process and have a say in what their public place is going to look like, both in the construction and the stewardship. Rhonda, do you agree with that, one? And two, how do cities better work with the people in place? In Akron, before we started our Reimagining the Civic Commons work, we had a long legacy of things being done to people and not with people. And people coming in and telling them how it's going to be and then leaving, and so we've really tried to make an effort around co-creation and co-stewardship. So love to hear your thoughts on how cities can do that better.
Absolutely. I appreciate you naming that and owning the past. And because Akron is not unique, I think we can say every city, every town has that as part of their legacy that we need to be correcting for. And so from my perspective, because this work is so relational, start with investing time. I know that we have a tendency to see, money as the primary resource, the primary vehicle for investment, but time is also a resource. And so if we can invest with time, building the connections and the trust before a project is even a twinkle in your eye, it's very common for us to walk through communities and neighborhoods and see all the things that we want to fix without making a connection with the people that we're walking past along the way. And so these are those moments, especially now that we're seeing one another outside more, to stop and introduce ourselves in these neighborhoods, in these communities. I know when I think about partnerships, I think about them as partnership with a capital P, and I think about them as partnership with a lowercase p. And I think all of them are necessary, but they don't carry the same weight. And from my perspective, and probably all of us, I imagine, when we have a capital P partnership, those are the ones where the folks in community not only know our organization's name, but they know us by name as we're walking through the community. And they know us in a very positive way. They don't see us as the folks that did, as you were just naming, Kyle, come in and then just bounce after we drop in and do this little project. And so when people know you by name as you're walking through the neighborhood, that gives you an indication of like what type of partnership you're actually in. And as you're looking to expand and move beyond the people that you have been partnering with traditionally, if you are really vested in these capital P partnerships, that community will vouch for you when you decide to extend yourself to communities in which you haven't yet worked, right? So there's a great benefit. It's about our humanity. It's very easy to get caught up in having to be so connected to our deliverables. I understand it. I'm a part of it. I definitely am not going to pretend like I go through this with a high level of perfection. But we all love these projects because they help us validate our existence. They help us validate our missions. But we also know that these projects are not going to fix the systemic injustices that we're trying to repair right now. So we need to figure out a way to repair to pair the two. So investing in capital P partnerships on a very, one-on-one human level before we get started on what is this project, what is this thing I'm trying to fix, I think is the best way for us to get started if you're not doing it already.
That's great. I love the capital P, lowercase p partnerships. I'll be stealing that. That's very appropriate for this work. Joe, Rhonda just touched on public spaces and equity. What about economic development? Public spaces have a very, powerful role in talent choosing cities and in cities becoming places where people want to live. Why is it good for city leaders, for their bottom line, to be investing in high quality public space?
Well, I just quickly say, what we've been tracking is through a series of studies we've done called Young and Restless, that well-educated young people are increasingly moving to cities in the United States. And the places they seem to be moving are the places that have lots of public and private amenities and great public spaces. And then they can also be a force, an economic force that reinforces those great spaces and then also helps stimulate the local economy. And we know that the biggest attractor for firms moving into places is the availability of talented workers. Now, that said, I just want to touch on something that Rhonda said, because I think there's a tension there. Ideally, you want to build a really strong relationship with folks in the community. But, there's this old saying about what a lie can run a mile before the truth gets its shoes on. And my concern is if we spend too much time thinking about process, there are a lot of, like highway departments with shovel-ready projects that are going to beat us to the punch. And one of the really encouraging things to me from a public space standpoint is how during the pandemic, how quickly we've modified, not in a permanent way, but in a trial way, public space. We've got restaurants spilling out onto sidewalks. We've got cities doing open streets, basically reallocating space from cars to bikes and pedestrians and to more active activities. And that spirit of quick innovation and then modifying it as we need to, tweaking it based on experience, seems to me to be really important. We need to have a sense of urgency as well as a commitment to engagement. Otherwise, I think we run the risk that waiting to get to consensus will leave us as also rans in what is really a fire drill over where this money goes.
And so, James, let's throw that challenge to you. How do you think about deploying these resources in the city, balancing both the need for resident engagement, but also you've only got 2.5, I think it's December of 2024, these funds need to be out the door, correct? So you got to move fairly quickly. How do you guys prioritize projects?
Yeah, so as I said before, I think we were blessed to have had the Civic Commons experience and to be a part of it and sort of to go through a lot of those years of surfacing, confronting, and reckoning with very bad and racially discriminatory past practices, but both of the city was complicit in as well as the state and federal governments. Not everyone has done that, as Rhonda said. And so I think the other thing, so two things that I would say to answer the question more directly is, I think what we've learned in Akron and in Detroit and in Chicago and Memphis and other cities is that you can prototype and you can invest while you're engaging. So I think that we have to get over the notion that it's a linear process, that we are going to sort of conceptualize a project, engage the community, and then get to the design bid process. So that we can actually get out into the communities where we've identified there being an equitable issue or an equity issue, I should say, and start to talk about maybe it's a group of vacant lots, maybe that needs activated. Maybe it is an existing park that has been run down and needs some TLC. And oftentimes it's not, the first investments out of the gate are not the iconic structures. They're new playgrounds, they're barbecues, they're fire pits. They're things that create, again, that welcoming, inviting moment that the neighborhood then sort of reclaims the space. And so I think you can do chew gum and walk at the same time with this. But then the other thing I would say is that I guarantee in every city of almost any size, whoever does the capital budget or someone who's working in parks maintenance or someone has a laundry list of needs that are just as shovel ready as that resurfacing project that somebody else might want to do. And so I think surfacing those, bringing those to the forefront and saying, hey, we've known for years that we have all of these outdated playgrounds that we have not figured out. We have in Akron, for example, we have way more baseball fields than we have use for anymore that was created and built long ago. So there's things like that you can pivot to that are less about not necessarily worthy of large engagement processes, but are low-hanging fruit things that could at least show the value or show the need within the bucket of public spaces. But again, I think the biggest answer there is that there are good models available already to American cities on how you can engage, invest, and create that cycle, ongoing cycle, so that it doesn't have to be linear and sort of start-stop, that you can do them both at the same time.
We're getting several questions from the panel, or excuse me, from the audience that I think are a good transition off your last comments, James, which is about maintenance. So let's say the folks who've been watching this webinar or came into it were thinking that public spaces is a good investment. What happens when the money runs out and it comes time to operate and maintain these assets? Let's go, Joe, and then Rhonda.
Yeah, that's a big challenge, and our friend at Strongtowns, Chuck Marone, makes a really good point that we think of infrastructure always as assets, and we tend to think of more as better. But with every asset comes the need to maintain it, and I think that's one of the things that we need to give some thought to. And I think as the experience in Akron illustrates, there is a lot of low-hanging fruit to spend money to fix up and repair and bring into a good state of good maintenance the existing assets that we have. And in many ways, that can be done very quickly. That creates jobs. So that probably should be one of the emphases that we really make in this discussion.
And I don't know the data point, but I'd be curious, if we took the entire parks maintenance budget for the city of Akron and applied that to road maintenance, how many miles of road would we get? 1/100th or one, I know it'd be a very small fraction of what we're spending on that stuff. So what are the investments that are going to have that outsized impact in the next 2 years? Rhonda, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, many years ago here in DC, I'm in Washington, DC, and when I was wearing a different hat professionally, I was working alongside a housing rights organization who was really lifting up a Black workforce project and program here in the district. And they ended up drafting a report called Training to Death, where we had all kinds of workforce development training opportunities to bring people in. They would give up, anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks of their time unpaid to get certified to do Project X with water infrastructure or some level of building infrastructure. And then at the end of that, there would be no job for them. There was always a way for folks to work around actually hiring these individuals. So they gave up so much of their time. And then at the same time, we're hearing the very true cry around the maintenance for our green infrastructures in our parks and on our city streets. And so I'm not sure where the detachment or the the separation of the two existed. I don't know what entity, what process is responsible for that. But I do want to push back a little bit though. And I do this often, probably at my own demise around this sentiment around urgency. I think when we do operate out of urgency, this is what we're left with. It's what happens next. And so when we are planning for the long haul, I agree that this maintenance actually is probably where we need to begin the conversation, because the building of the park and the green space infrastructure is kind of the easy part, right? But the part around that maintenance is real. That's all I can say about it. Is it's a very real dilemma, and we need to stop overlooking it in our planning and design phase.
James, any thoughts on maintenance operations? I know you spend a lot of time on that on the average week.
Yeah, two thoughts. One is that, again, I think to the maintenance point is also my point, that I think the best place to start is within your existing park system. Just look at what you've got already, and is it quality, is it not? The second thing, which Rhonda illuminated for me as well, is that there's so much opportunity for equity in who is building these. What are the contractors? It's a great opportunity to diversify the supplier base for a city. We are working here in Akron, but there are tons of programs across the country to do minority capital access for contractors, small, medium, and large, prime, sub, and everyone in between. I think there's a great opportunity to make sure you also are being intentional about who is getting the bids at the end of the day to do the projects within the parks. That's a great opportunity for us to also bring in construction managers and landscapers and all kinds of others who know their business very well and can help with the maintenance question, but also at the same time, ultimately diversify your supplier base.
James, is Akron doing anything in purchasing to operationalize that?
Yeah, so we just hired our supplier diversity manager, which a lot of organizations in the private sector have, but more and more in the public sector. We did a full study examining, we took our 2019 data and broke it apart to see how equitable we are. And the mayor felt strongly we needed to make that public. And so our number, our black spend for the city of Akron in 2019 was 5%. It's atrocious. And I think that was a motivating factor to sort of put out a call, not just for internally at the city, for all of us to change. And we now are creating this space within our procurement, but also a specific division that works alongside all of us as department heads to diversify, but a call to the greater community that we need procurement reform. That this is, again, another area, as we're about to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in our community, who are winning the bids, who is ultimately getting these service contracts. That could be a great opportunity for us to build wealth and equity within that.
In the time we have remaining, let's talk about the future. This is but one tranche of funds, that an important tranche, but more federal money will be coming, and city budgets renew each year. So any thoughts on how getting it right in this moment can help inform the future moves of a city and the priorities of a city? Rhonda, I see you nodding, so I'll start with you.
Well, I'm mostly nodding because that is the question.
Yeah, exactly right. It feels like a moment to prove it. I mean, we've been taught, if you were a city that was in a tough environment of scarcity prior, and now all of a sudden it feels more flush because of the federal funding, now's a moment to stop talking and start walking. And the shovels that get put in the ground with these funds are going to be the best illustration of where your priorities really are. And so, how can leaders that want to get it right?
Well, I think in one instance is to take stock of where your investments have already occurred and go elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So we have a tendency, especially when we're fighting against time, to go to the quick and easy win. This is a community we've been working with for the last 20 years, and we know them there, and they know how to manage the funds, and they're very comfortable and familiar in this space. And so yet again, they continue to get reinvested, and then we still have community across the highway that still keeps missing that opportunity because they don't have a relationship. Maybe they don't have the same fiscal strength that makes them feel like a community partner to receive these fundings. And so I just want to encourage us to step away from our norm, remove ourselves from our status quo and challenge ourselves a little bit more. And one of the ways we can start that is looking in our environmental justice communities and begin there, because those are the areas, again, that we have to continue to play catch up with. And I think that also looking at the communities that are in our the communities that we're prioritizing, that are founded and led by the people of color that lived in those neighborhoods. So one of the things we see in many cities, we've got a lot of well-funded, wonderful community-based organizations that don't actually live and exist within the communities that are receiving the services or the work or the project or what have you. And I would love to invite us to turn that around. I think we can get a lot farther that way because we're not starting at the same place.
Joe, are there data points that cities should be looking at? How does City Observatory to identify parts of a city or a neighborhood that should be made a priority for public space investment?
Yeah, I think looking for the underinvested spaces is really good. I think to a point that Alexa Bush made from Detroit the other day, thinking about critical mass, how all the pieces fit together to get you to triggering a change in a neighborhood is really important. So being strategic about that is important. I think we've touched on the major points here. You want stuff that reduces your maintenance costs now, that hopefully has some sustainability to it, and then contributes to the economy of the area. That is, changes the incentives for investment so that an area becomes better resourced over time. And I'll just give you one data point, which is we know building more highways, widening highways, unequivocally reduces city population. I mean, that's just statistical fact. So the more we invest in certain kinds of infrastructure, the more we really undermine the health of our economies. In contrast, we know that investments in public space, as demonstrated by the Gale report, it really is an opportunity to trigger greater economic health. And then that's really the foundation for a lot of the sustainability that we're looking for.
One question from the audience around policy recommendations around maintenance. Maintenance is a popular one today. Do you know of any cities that have done a good job around a policy to operate and maintain public space after it's built? James, I see you nodding, so I'll start with you.
They are out there. I would say that a great resource is the City Parks Alliance. Greater Greener had a big focus on that, I think, right before at the convening before the pandemic, that obviously New York City is a best-in-class example of how they keep track of every asset in a park and its age, and when something breaks, they're right out there. Obviously, we can't all be necessarily at that level, but I do think that we are trying, at least in our situation, more the mid-sized American city, trying to take what we can from it. How do you utilize 311? How do you geocode? I know this is really getting wonky, but we're launching a project this year where we're going to have summer interns literally taking pictures of and geocoding every park bench, every tree, everything that's in a park, so that our parks maintenance group, which is a fraction of what it used to be, underpaid, undervalued, like all the other cities in America, but we can at least equip them with technology and the ability to track our spend within city parks and make a better value argument come budget time. Hey, look, we've done X amount of calls for service. We've had to fix this bench 100 times. We've had to, all these different things. We can then use data to make a better case for ourselves that we need to increase parks maintenance. So we're playing catch up, at least in our town around that. But I do know that, again, City Parks Alliance might be a great resource for folks to check out or ask them what cities are really doing this well.
Great. And Rhonda and Joe, I'm getting a note that we are getting up on time. So maybe share your thoughts, and then how people can engage with Trust for Public Land and then City Observatory in the weeks and months ahead to continue to learn from your respective networks. So Rhonda, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think I mentioned at the top, on May 27th, we will be doing our annual launch of the updated park score. I'm not going to give you any sneak peeks, but it's very exciting, particularly as we talk about public space and equity. There's a lot to be said there, so please log in to tpl.org and follow us there. And also, if anybody is interested in having a deeper conversation with me directly, or if you look for a connection within our organization, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. I'd be very happy to connect with you. And I just want to lastly just say thank you for this conversation. I appreciate the different dynamics that we're here. So that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Joe, take us home.
Yeah, thanks. And you can follow our work at City Observatory. We're spending a lot of time right now on sort of the flip side of the equation, which is working with freeway fights around the country, because there are a lot of places around the country where we know there's a lot of resources and unfortunately a lot of political attention going into projects that are really undermining the public realm rather than helping it. So visit us at City Observatory to learn more.
That is a whole webinar in and of itself, what you ended there. But James, any closing thoughts?
No, I just appreciate the conversation, and I would tell all of my city colleagues watching that it will be okay, and you will find a way to make good investments, and always here to help.
Yeah, James, Rhonda, Joe, thank you so much for your comments. And I'll say on behalf of Knight, we wanted to convene this webinar because we know this is a once-in-a-lifetime moment, and there's a lot for us all to learn. So we look forward to continuing the conversation the weeks and months ahead, and really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, and welcome to The Future of Democracy, a show about the trends, ideas, and disruptions changing the face of our democracy. I'm Yvette Alexander, Director of Learning and Impact at Knight Foundation. Today, our show focuses on unpacking how racial attitudes affect American opinions on policy and social issues, including election laws and free expression. Knight has a long history of commissioning research to understand how free expression attitudes are evolving over time. We count ourselves immensely fortunate to have our guest today advising the foundation on this research. By the way, please make sure to ask your questions using the hashtag KnightLive or drop them in a comment. Now, please welcome to the show David Wilson, incoming Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. Hi, David.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Good to see you again today. I'm just going to let our viewers know some brief background. David is currently a professor of political science and psychological and brain sciences at the University of Delaware, where he is wrapping up his role as Senior Associate Dean for Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences. David is a political psychologist. He studies political behavior using survey-based experiments, and his research has been published in many of the top outlets for public opinion research. Prior to his appointment at the University of Delaware, he was senior statistical consultant and researcher at Gallup, and he holds bachelor's from Western Kentucky University and a PhD in political science from Michigan State. His upcoming book, Racial Resentment in the Political Mind, will examine how racial resentment motivates resistance to improve the circumstances faced by racial minorities. And in addition to his scholarly contributions, I discovered that David also served in Desert Storm and that he has managed to visit every national park in the United States, a fact I hope we have time to probe on at the end of the program. So thanks again, David, for joining us and for sharing your wonderful research with us today and how it can shape our future. So let's dive in, and I'm going to cut right to the chase. What exactly is this term racial resentment? What do political scientists mean by that? And why does understanding it matter to the future of our democracy?
Yeah, so you can think about resentment as believing that someone is getting something they don't deserve. It's the very basic definition. And if you get something that one feels like you don't deserve, it doesn't make you happy. It doesn't make you prideful. It makes you a bit upset about how someone is violating rules. And racial resentment is about deep-seated beliefs that race is an unfair criteria for the distribution of rewards or merit in society. So racial resentment tends to ignore the history of race in society, in American society especially, and tends to ignore the ways in which race can impact the lives of others. Now, it's important to keep in mind from a scholarly perspective that resentment is not the same as prejudice or racism. And the research that we do in the Racial Resentment and Political Mind book seeks to help the public and scholars as well understand the nuance of racial attitudes, how race as a criteria for processing information, as a filter for thinking about things, doesn't just have one pathway. It's not just about the racial target group being inferior or needing to be held down or having certain cultural traits. It could be about the use of race in broader society in general, so that when you have a policy that may benefit racial ethnic minorities, people immediately come to resent it, not simply because minorities may need support, but because they feel like race should not be the basis of that need. Other people have problems as well. It doesn't matter that one group may be in a stronger position to be successful in life. It matters that for the racially resentful person, that everybody has the opportunity to work as hard as they can, and then they get what life gives them. And we call that a just world belief system, where people believe that good people get good things and bad people get bad things. But when there's a disconnect, bad people getting good things or good people getting bad things, then we tend to kind of raise our surveillance and our alarms about something being fair or not. And racial resentment is really about how mostly dominant group members tend to think that minority group members are unfairly benefiting on the basis of race, and that most people today have not had anything to do with the problems of the past.
That's really interesting, and I think it does add a lot of nuance to the conversation on racism and racial views in the U.S. today. It sounds like that some of what you just described, the distribution of resources and the criteria, kind of challenges American notions of a meritocracy or the bootstrap idea mentality that I think we all kind of inherited in our culture. Can you explain a little bit more about how these sort of beliefs about justice, fairness, and deservingness make ordinary citizens appear racist? What sorts of outcomes, can lead to that appearance, or the issues in society that could extend racist systems?
Yeah. So in the study of political behavior, which is essentially human behavior when you have to make decisions. So politics is not just about parties and government. Politics is whenever you have to bring people together to decide on something, or when an individual has to make a decision, they use information to help make that decision. That information can be biased, it could be skewed in some direction, it can be false, but they're still going to decide, and that is the essence of politics, deciding. And so what happens is people tend to believe they know enough. They tend to rely on things that are at their disposal, their friends, their family, their early experiences, what comes to mind, their groups, and things like merit seem obvious. Like, well, if I work hard, I should get X. They don't tend to think about, well, some people can do things easier than others. So is it really about hard work, or is it about talent? And then what is a measure of hard work? Is it productivity? Is it quality? Is it overall performance? And who rates these things? Who decides? And mostly people walk around without having to process these questions. Well, if I take a class and I make a high grade, I should then be rewarded with a degree or an A or something to that effect. But maybe there are other aspects of merit that really matter, because merit is just an appraisal of how you're performing based on some set of standards. And so for the political psychologists, we're interested in those standards. Who set up those standards? Who's making the evaluation? And what people get because of that. Justice comes into play when some people believe the standards are either fair and somebody's getting something and they haven't met the standard, or they think it's unfair because they're not getting something that someone else is getting. And so justice becomes this standard that people use related to merit definitions that they may not really think about. And when policies come out that support single mothers, rural farmers, senior citizens, veterans, immigrants, people that have lost their homes, or companies that want to locate in an area and get tax breaks. When those policies come out, people think about them in terms of whether it's fair, whether they should have gotten the policy benefit. And that process comes to replicate the same thinking that happens in racism and racial inequity beliefs, in that something is not fair. And so race as a criteria for merit is not fair in the minds of many people, because they don't feel like they had anything to do with race, and therefore they shouldn't be punished. And it's not always them being punished, but they feel like it's unfair that others are getting things and they're not. Or race could be used in a way that's, I don't like this group, and this group shouldn't get anything regardless of how hard they work. Both of those things can still lead to the same policy position. And what research has shown is that they're not just about racial targeted policy. They come to affect any policy that helps anyone in society. In other words, gives anyone some advantage regardless of how hard they work. So giving seniors a tax break comes to be resented. And racial attitudes even affect these policy issues because they feel like some rule has been broken. Even seniors are expected to do something to get an outcome. And since people don't have full information, they don't know what seniors are doing, they tend to say, well, until we know what they're doing, they're not deserving of that benefit. And this is a basic process that happens along the way, from parenting to thinking about who should live in your neighborhood, to thinking about who should be promoted to a certain grade or in a job, or who should be your boss and who shouldn't. It's the reason why we have selection committees, because we need to have diverse perspectives to choose. And again, choosing is politics.
And it seems like a lot of our views is shaped by information we're consuming from a very young age that we're mostly unconscious of the consumption process happening, right? And how it's shaping our beliefs. So underlying racial resentment, it's not something you can easily see and touch. Oftentimes it's not something that people are aware of themselves, ourselves. So maybe it seems also very powerful, right, in terms of its subconscious, or maybe because of its subconscious nature. So maybe you can unpack for a moment, how research can empirically prove, A, that it exists, and more importantly, that it has an impact on the way Americans view policy issues.
Yes, very good question. So resentment is a sentiment, and it's a little bit different than a pure emotion. So happiness and anger are what we call primary emotions. They're the essence. Resentment is a sentiment, and a sentiment combines emotion and belief. In other words, the emotion could activate the belief, or the belief could activate the emotion, but you've got to have both of them together to have the sentiment. And so knowing that means that, one, we have to be able to study people's beliefs. And if those beliefs can tap into these inconsistencies such that there's a level of deservingness, and that in order for someone to get rewarded, they have to meet the criteria for the reward. And we can ask people, how do you feel when somebody gets something they don't deserve? Or let me pose an argument to you that reflects a level of undeservingness, such as special considerations on the basis of race, or that certain groups should not use race to gain advantages in society, or even meet equality to gain equality in society. Or that sometimes certain groups are pushing too hard and they should just wait their turn in society, and that kind of thing. Those kinds of questions, when people agree with them, they are literally tapping into a belief system. And the combination of that belief system reflects what we call an ideology. Now, most people just think of ideology in two dimensions, liberal and conservative, but an ideology is just a collection of beliefs. And they're a collection of beliefs about a certain set of standards and ideas, or values, as we like to talk about. So values about change. I don't think change is good. Well, okay, if that's the case, then what about racial progress? That's changing from a group status from one level to another. Well, if you're opposed to change in general, then it's easier for you to resent policies that may help one group gain additional status. Deservingness. If you believe in certain standards of merit, that, for example, the way that things are distributed in society now are fair and work well for you, then when somebody's pushing to change those standards to give other people an advantage, you will come to resent that change because it's meaning you may lose out or you may have to take some additional steps to change your life. And that's not fair. That's not just. One of the key areas, again, is climate change, for example. Climate change has nothing to do with race in a broader sense, but racial attitudes come to have a correlation with opposition to policies that help to improve the climate. Why is that? Because climate change policy requires almost everybody to have to change. And so this notion of society kind of being fine the way it is means you don't want to change. Policies that improve racial situations require change. You oppose change, you may oppose the group. So all of it gets conflated to show the same thing. So our job as survey researchers is to get people to think about the issue in a certain way and measure that through surveys, and then have another group that's not being told to think about it in a certain way, and then comparing those responses. So we could essentially prime people's resentful sentiments and then see how they affect other things through data and other mechanisms. It's a standard kind of political or just behavioral psychological research.
Yeah. Great. Maybe we can, bring it down to specific topics that I know some of your research has touched. So, we all had a very, contentious election year last year, and the idea of engagement was front and center. And ease of people to act, to exercise their voting rights was front and center. And now we have some voter ID laws that, that came into play as well. Can you talk a little bit about, your research on how attitudes towards race intersected with this idea of voter identification and policies around it?
Yeah, another subtle area about the status quo being kept as is. So voter ID laws came about after the 2000 election, primarily between Bush v. Gore, where the world pretty much witnessed there could be an election where someone gets more votes and still loses. And that concerned people. And so there were calls to improve the election system, but there was some politics behind it. And those politics said, well, this works for us. Maybe we should consider laws that allow it to happen, but don't give the open appearance that that's what we like to do. So right now, you don't need an identification to register to vote, but you do need an identification in a majority of states to vote. And in some states, you need what we call a strict form of identification, a picture, a signature, government issue, up-to-date, signature matching, all of these things. So when we started looking at voter ID laws, we found that the incidences of voter impersonation or fraud were less than 1/100 of a single percent, that it wasn't occurring very often, but we tended to see these new policies being pushed forward that we needed to have voter ID laws to minimize fraud. The 2000 election wasn't about fraud. It was actually about the system itself. But these things percolated through the system and have come into play and be expected. My research shows that the reason why it's so broadly accepted by the public is because they don't see it as controversial at all. And what the resentment piece is people think that ID is so commonplace that it's the status quo. And if you're trying to allow people to vote without showing ID, then you're disrupting the status quo. That's threatening to many people. And they come to see or start thinking about, well, who would be doing this? Who would be trying to vote without ID? I have ID. What's the problem? Well, many seniors don't have ID issued by the government. Many people living in urban areas, because they don't need to drive, don't have IDs issued by the federal government or state government. Many students who are just becoming voting age and live in areas where they don't need to drive and they just have their student ID, don't have that federal ID. One could even argue that you could give a free voting ID to someone, but even that requires a level of ID to prove that you need ID. And so the research has showed that these tend to be, support for a voter ID tends to be motivated in large part by beliefs about who is trying to skirt the rules, that is, who's trying to violate justice to vote, even though it's not a problem that exists in society. So we tend to call those non-attitudes or apolitical attitudes, and they exist because Most people don't find the issue controversial, but they find having to change the issue controversial.
Yeah, wow. And free expression is another area I know that your research has touched, and Knight's mission is also very closely related to our belief in in the importance of exercising rights of free expression. I think you're a little bit more focused in looking at how the attitudes towards that and the distribution of rights and enforcement related to free expression. Could you share a little bit about what recent research has shown on that topic?
Yeah. One way to think about free expression is, if we all have it, is who also deserves to have it. And in many ways, when people are imbued with rights, they tend to value those rights and put them on a pedestal of importance and set up criteria for other people to get those rights and to get them at some level. And what we see a lot of times is that some groups, we can call them members of our own group or in-group members, tend to think that our group members need to reach some level of deservingness before they can have the same status and the same level of rights as others. This happens with parents and children. Children need to go to a certain level of progress and status growth before they should be able to talk and have conversation or sit at the big table with adults. You can think about this the same way with oppressed groups and non-oppressed groups, or groups that are lower in status or groups that are higher in status. And so as you're thinking about who deserves free expression, your biases kick in, and not just biases about disliking groups, but your biases about the means by which they tend to express themselves. And so you can look at, for example, an insurrection at the Capitol of the United States as one form of free expression versus a peaceful protest. People could look at those two events in the same way, or they can look at them differently depending on their own personal biases and perspectives. This is a challenge for democracy because people tend to interpret these kinds of rights through their own lens rather than through a lens of the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, and equality, and fairness, and justice. And once you start using your own personal lens to evaluate things, you lose the Constitution. You lose the idea of a United States. And we're seeing, in public opinion research, we're seeing more and more dispute of basic facts and basic ideas about who should get what, when, and how in society. And that's a challenge for democracy because we either have to learn to live with it and accept that democracies don't work a certain way within a republic, or we have to accept that our democracy is flawed, or somewhere in between there. And we see a lot of that expressed in public opinion that is both flawed and a challenge.
Right. It sounds like a hard place to invite folks to come and sit with the challenges that are there. And, and yes.
But here's the key thing. If I'm a leader, if I'm an elected official, I can just convince people that, hey, it's still better than every place else in the world. Right. And then for someone who's living here that says, yeah, but it's lower than our standards should be. Right. So the contention is not one where there's a right or wrong answer. There's just a rub against the values that we purport to believe in. So justice, fairness, equality, prosperity, commonalities. The whole idea of a United States is that we can be 50 different states, 50 or so different states, but we could surround ourselves around a common cause of justice, fairness, and an American way of life of some type. So.
Yeah, I think there's some questions coming in that are going in the direction that I wanted to take the conversation anyway. So I'll use the questions that we have here from the audience. I think it's wonderful that we're getting a better understanding of these things, of underlying racial attitudes and how they affect policy views, social views. But what can we do to, what action can be taken as a result of this growing understanding? What could we do to ensure policies are being made to enact change when it comes to, race or other issues where there's, there's a minority contingency involved?
I don't know how old the country is in reality, but we haven't figured that out yet. So I definitely don't have an answer to what we can do. I can talk about what seems to not work. What seems to not work is thinking that there is one solution that can happen with one policy at one time for all groups in work. There has to be, if you want to see racial equality and racial progress large scale, there has to be an understanding that there is a history that's led to systemic differences in society. When we think about something like the unemployment rate and we break it down, and if you see that on average, whites tend to be unemployed at 4% right now, but African Americans tend to be unemployed at 8%, which is above the standard of 7 of high unemployment, then one could either conclude that African Americans are not doing their part, or they can conclude that there's systemic racism, or there could be somewhere in between where there may be a little bit of both. And what happens is we just talk about the opposites, and that's what the discourse becomes about. And both sides tend to believe that they're right and the other group's not listening to them. Politics is about being able to make decisions, and government is about being able to talk about those things and enact them. And what we tend to see now is really a denial that there's a problem still. And if you're a data person like me, you see a problem. If you're a behaviorist like me, you see a problem. If you're a person that believes, there is no problem, then you think everything's fine and you don't want to change, or you see that we should become more restrictive. And I often tell people that racism is, looking for racism in society is like looking for love in a marriage. It's, you see it when you want to, and you don't when you don't want to see it. So, the effects of racism are longstanding and not just about some group getting something in society. It's about us thinking about our moral engagement and what we purport to believe that America is about or not, and that other people are watching when we're doing this. And if they don't believe we're trying, but we continue to say we are, then they'll lose faith in us, and our standing in the world will be diminished.
Wow, that sounds like the stakes are pretty high. What I'm hearing is that for now, just the simply awareness around the problem is our mission and our challenge as we try to sort out, where to go from here. Somebody else is asking here in the chat, what is one thing that has stood out to you over the last year in terms of American political preferences and racial attitudes? Like, is there something that folks would be aware of from the events of the pandemic 2020 that you could shed some light on how these underlying sentiments, as you put it, affected how people viewed the policy issue?
Policy issue of COVID, or
anything from 2020, the whole bucket.
A lot happened last year. The first thing I'll say is that this is not just about awareness, right? This is very important to understand that just exposing people to information is not enough. You've got to care enough to want to change because of that information, and not only care to want to change, but be willing to tolerate the cost of it. This is where you get people kind of checking out that you want to create a better world. I don't think anybody wants to create a worse world. So wanting to create a better world means that you'll consume information that tells you how to do it. Now, if it means that you need to take an hour each day to do something, that's a different question. Or if it means that you have to reallocate a little bit of the wealth you have to others, that's a different question. Or if it means you have to tolerate your neighbor playing their radio a little bit louder, that's a different question. If it means you have to understand a different language, that's a different question. So the motivational piece, you have to have a will to want to actually do it and believe that the pathway to doing that is tolerance. And that's what a democracy is supposed to be about. But again, we're a republic and not a pure democracy. So people tend to say, well, we do have rules now. You can't just have everybody have the same voice. Some people have to be citizens. They have to not have a criminal record. They have to meet a certain age threshold. They have to pass certain tests. We have all of these things in place. So 2020, we saw a contested election that was, from a political science standpoint, that was very unsettling because we look for evidence of problems. And when we don't see any evidence, but we see elected officials still saying there's a problem, we don't have much of a leg to stand on in terms of knowledge. The U.S. has always been a leader in higher education and accepting information at its value and really being rigorous about that information. And when we started to see pushback on that, then we didn't know how to kind of, make heads or tails of it. People talked about not leaving office. And then when the insurrection happened, which was not 2020, but 2021, it told us that finally we are understanding that humans are actually humans. We don't have perfect information. We tend to believe things that aren't necessarily true. We can't always change people's opinions with facts and information. And our moral direction depends on not what our values are as a country, but what we want to see as individuals and as groups. So when COVID happened and we needed people to wear masks to help other people become protected, it became a contested issue around liberty and freedom, which was like something that was a no-brainer, and that was unsettling to us. And so we had to really come back and understand you can't come out and report that the public is just a bunch of biased individuals, even though we all are. You can't come out and say that they're just taking a position on something because it's political. You have to really understand that behavior. And so 2020 was really about trying to gauge what are the motivations of people. Why do they choose positions, again, against their own self-interest? And we kept coming down to they resist change when it requires them to do something that they feel is unjust or unfair. And that took us in the same direction about resenting when governments tell you to do things that you don't think you should have to do.
And it touches again, I think, on the idea of will and public will when costs or perceived costs are involved. And so, I'd like to start to close maybe with your thoughts on that. Like, is there a point of view from yourself or from the field at large on what might be done to start to generate will when it comes to these issues?
It's a tough question because the country is not just polarized on the issues, they're polarized on people. And they come to conflate the two. We call them in political psychology, we call them schemas. And so you have a schema for how you think government should behave, a schema for how your life should go, a schema for how your state should act, a schema for how your favorite team should behave and who they should sign and all these things. And they come to overlap. And so there's some type of an association, whereas people could be talking about something related to the economy, and that schema overlaps with someone's thoughts about race, or someone's thoughts about poverty, or someone's thoughts about immigration. So you don't have to talk about immigration. You can just talk about the economy, and it actually influenced people's beliefs about immigration. You can think about the same thing with voting laws and the like that. We find a strong correlation between voting laws and race because people tend to think about one group pushing on civil rights and opposing voting restrictions and those kinds of things, and that connects with power and other issues. So this is a tough period for us and for us in America, and to think about free expression, to think about things like Black Lives Matter, and then having to contrast that with some other group's lives mattering, and ignoring substance, but thinking about superficial value and contention as a way to prove we win and someone else loses, that zero-sum world. That is in the political science world, the slippery slope to diminished status. And that's where we are starting to think about this work more, is where is our country going, and how do we understand public opinion when the numbers show one thing, but when we do a deep dive, they're actually showing something that is a hard conversation and a hard way to change things. And that's where we are.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the important contributions that you and your research colleagues are making on these issues and understanding them better. Last words from you before we close our show today. You visited all the national parks. Which ones would you be most excited to visit again?
Well, I visited every national park in the continental United States. There are a few in remote Alaska, in Dry Tortugas National Park in Florida. America Samoa is out in the middle of, those are different kinds of trips. But I think the national park system is a great way to see the country. Any park in Utah you can't lose. Rocky Mountain National Park, of course, the standard Yosemite. There's a new national park that used to be a monument, White Sands National Park in New Mexico is gorgeous. and of course the Everglades National Park and those in South Florida are excellent. So there's Maine has great ones. They're all low. Montana Glacier National Park is excellent. So I just encourage people to get out there and see the country in a different way, and not just think about the people, but experience the place as well.
Yeah, we're excited to do it. So that's all we have time for today. Thanks again, David, for joining us and sharing your knowledge on these topics. As a reminder, this and prior Future Democracy podcast episodes can be found on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Remember to hit subscribe. You can also stream on demand on the Knight Foundation website, kf.org/FD show. Join us next week for Knight's Informed and Engaged show, where we explore ideas and solutions for a changing media landscape. And have a great rest of your day.